Well, hello, friends. Thank you so much for joining me for another episode of Reading Michael Jackson. I am your host, Lena, and I am so happy to be here with you again today to continue our reading of Moonwalk. Wow, okay, so it is episode 10, which if you were with me last season, feels like nothing. We had almost 50 episodes last season, but this season's different. Moonwalk, in a lot of ways, will be a shorter read for us than Dancing the Dream was. So at episode 10, we are already over halfway through this season. Now, this is 10 pure episodes of season 2. There have been 3 bonus episodes, so you've been listening to a lot. But we have only 8 episodes left. So as a reminder, we will be finishing this season the week of the Michael Jackson biopic release, which this episode is being released on February 24th, which is exactly 2 months until the Michael biopic. So I'm really, really excited about it as it's getting closer. Are you excited? I'm curious about it. Are you getting excited about it? Are you feeling wary about it? Are you feeling conflicted about it? You know, any emotion would make sense to me at this point in the game. I am personally really looking forward to it. I'm looking forward to seeing the kind of recreation of the events Michael has been telling us about in this book and seeing how they are presented to the world and how much they match Michael's description and, you know, how much they don't. I'm looking forward to that. So I can't wait. I know they keep releasing new teasers. There was one that just came out a couple of days ago. I think it was debuted during the NBA All-Star game. If you haven't seen that one, go take a look. It's excellent. And it's short. It's just a short TV spot trailer, but new clips of Jafar as Michael, more showing his personality a little bit, which is super exciting. And I have to say, Jafar is adorable. He's not Michael, because no one is, and no one could hope to be, but he's adorable. So I get the sense that, unlike so many of the other biopics or attempts of telling stories about Michael and his life, my impression is that this will be quite respectful. So I am very excited. And now that we are just 2 months away from the movie, I don't know. I can't get enough. I'm so excited. So I'm happy that we are doing this and we are already halfway through Moonwalk. So last week we closed out chapter 3, which really ended on the note of Michael reflecting on the impact of the whiz. And what I liked about that chapter is that it ended with this reflection about how the whiz was meaningful to Michael just on a personal level. But of course, it ends with this sort of cliffhanger of Michael connecting with Quincy Jones. So that is exactly where we are picking up today at the start of chapter 4. Chapter 4 is called Me and Q, which is kind of like a cute little play on me and you. But anyway, Me and Q. And if you want to follow along, I will be reading from pages 145 to 160. So now's the time that I invite you to relax, get comfortable, get cozy, and join me for this continued reading of Moonwalk. Chapter 4. I had actually first met Quincy Jones in Los Angeles when I was about 12 years old. Quincy later told me that at the same time, Sammy Davis Jr. had said to him, "This kid is going to be the next biggest thing since sliced bread." Something like that, anyway. And Quincy said, "Oh yeah?" I was little at the time, but I vaguely remember Sammy Davis introducing me to Q. Our friendship really began to blossom on the set of The Wiz, and it developed into a father-son relationship. After The Wiz, I called him and said, "Look, I'm going to do an album. Do you think you could recommend some producers?" I wasn't hinting. My question was a naive but honest one. We talked about music for a while, and after coming up with some names and some half-hearted hemming and hawing, he said, "Why don't you let me do it?" I really hadn't thought of it. It sounded to him as if I was hinting, but I wasn't. I just didn't think he would be that interested in my music. So I stammered something like, "Oh, sure, great idea. I never thought about that." Quincy still kids me about it. Anyway, we immediately began to plan the album that became Off the Wall. My brothers and I decided to form our own production company, and we began thinking about names to call it. You don't find many articles about peacocks in the newspaper, but around this time, I found the only one that mattered. I had always thought peacocks were beautiful and had admired one that Berry Gordy had at one of his homes. So when I read the article, which had an accompanying picture of a peacock and revealed a great deal about the bird's characteristics, I was excited. I thought I might have found the image we were looking for. It was an in-depth piece, a little dry in places, but interesting. The writer said that the peacock's full plumage would explode only when it was in love, and then all the colors would shine, all the colors of the rainbow on one body. I was immediately taken with that beautiful image and the meaning behind it. That bird's plumage conveyed the message I was looking for to explain the Jacksons and our intense devotion to one another, as well as our multifaceted interests. My brothers liked the idea, so we called our new company Peacock Productions to sidestep the trap of relying too heavily on the Jackson name. Our first world tour had focused our interest in uniting people of all races through music. Some people we knew wondered what we meant when we talked about uniting all races through music. After all, we were Black musicians. Our answer was, music is colorblind. We saw that every night, especially in Europe and the other parts of the world we had visited. The people we met there loved our music. It didn't matter to them what color our skin was or which country we called home. We wanted to form our own production company because we wanted to grow and establish ourselves as a new presence in the music world, not just as singers and dancers, but as writers, composers, arrangers, producers, even publishers. We were interested in so many things, and we needed an umbrella company to keep track of our projects. CBS had agreed to let us produce our own album. The last 2 albums had sold well, but Different Kind of Lady showed a potential that they agreed was worth letting us develop. They did have one condition for us. They signed an A&R man, Bobby Colomby, who used to be with Blood, Sweat, and Tears, to check in with us from time to time to see how we were doing and to see if we needed any help. We knew that the 5 of us needed some outside musicians to get the best possible sound, and we were weak in 2 areas, the keyboard and arranging side of things. We had been faithfully adding all the new technology to our Encino studio without really having a mastery of it. Greg Fillinganes was young for a studio pro, but that was a plus so far as we were concerned because we wanted someone who would be more open to newer ways of doing things than the seasoned veterans we had encountered over the years. He came to Encino to do pre-production work, and we all took turns surprising each other. Our mutual preconceptions just dissolved. It was a great thing to watch. As we sketched out our new songs for him, we told him that we liked the vocal tracks that Philly International always put a premium on. But when the mix came out, we always seemed to be fighting someone else's wall of sound, all those strings and cymbals. We wanted sound cleaner and more funky, with a flintier bass and sharper horn parts. With his beautiful rhythm arrangements, Greg put into musical form what we were sketching for him, and then some. We felt he was reading our minds. A Bobby Colomby recruit who came to work with us was Paulino da Costa, whom we worried about because it seemed to us that Randy was being told that he couldn't handle all the percussion himself. But Paulino brought with him the Brazilian samba tradition of adapting and improvising on primitive and often homemade instruments. When da Costa's sound joined forces with Randy's more conventional approach, we seemed to have the whole world covered. Artistically speaking, we were caught between a rock and a hard place. We had worked with the smartest, hippest pop people in the world at Motown and Philly International, and we would have been fools to discount the things we'd absorbed from them. Yet, we couldn't be imitators. Fortunately, we got a running start with a song that Bobby Colomby brought to us called Blame It on the Boogie. It was an up-tempo, finger-poppin' song that was good vehicle for the band approach we wanted to cultivate. I had fun slurring the chorus. Blame It on the Boogie could be sung in one breath without putting my lips together. We had a little fun with the credits on the inner sleeve of the record. Blame It on the Boogie was written by 3 guys from England, including one named Michael Jackson. It was a startling coincidence. As it turned out, writing disco songs was a natural for me because I was used to having dance breaks incorporated into all of the major songs I was asked to sing. There was a lot of uncertainty and excitement about our future. We were going through a lot of creative and personal changes. Our music, the family dynamics, our desires and goals. All of this made me think more seriously about how I was spending my life, especially in relation to other people my age. I had always shouldered a lot of responsibility, but it suddenly seemed that everyone wanted a piece of me. There wasn't that much to go around, and I needed to be responsible to myself. I had to take stock of my life and figure out what people wanted from me and to whom I was going to give wholly. It was a hard thing for me to do, but I had to learn to be wary of some of the people around me. God was at the top of my list of priorities, and my mother and father and brothers and sisters followed. I was reminded of that old song by Clarence Carter called Patches, where the oldest son is asked to take care of the farm after his father dies, and his mother tells him she's depending on him. Well, we weren't sharecroppers, and I wasn't the oldest, but those were slim shoulders on which to place such burdens. For some reason, I always found it difficult to say no to my family and the other people I loved. I would be asked to do something or take care of something, and I would agree, even if I worried that it might be more than I could handle. I felt under a great deal of stress, and I was often emotional. Stress can be a terrible thing. You can't keep your emotions bottled up for long. There were a lot of people at this time who wondered just how committed I was to music after learning of my newfound interest in movies after being in one. It was hinted that my decision to audition had come at a bad time for the new band setup. It seemed, to outsiders, to come just as we were about to get started. But of course, it worked out just fine. That's what you get for being polite, was my way of letting on that I knew I wasn't living in an ivory tower and that I had insecurities and doubts, just as all older teenagers do. I was worried that the world and all it had to offer could be passing me by, even as I tried to get on top of my field. There was a Gamble and Huff song called Dreamer on the first Epic album, which had this theme, and as I was learning it, I felt they could have written it with me in mind. I have always been a dreamer. I set goals for myself. I look at things and I try to imagine what is possible and then hope to surpass those boundaries. In 1979, I turned 21 years old and began to take full control of my career. My father's personal management contract with me ran out around this time, and although it was a hard decision, the contract was not renewed. Trying to fire your dad is not easy. But I just didn't like the way certain things were being handled. Mixing family and business can be a delicate situation. It can be great, or it can be awful. It depends on the relationships. Even at the best of times, it's a hard thing to do. Did it change the relationship between me and my father? I don't know if it did in his heart, but it certainly didn't in mine. It was a move I knew I had to make because at the time I was beginning to feel that I was working for him rather than that he was working for me. And on the creative side, we are of two completely different minds. He would come up with ideas that I would totally disagree with because they weren't right for me. All I wanted was control over my own life, and I took it. I had to do it. Everyone comes to that point sooner or later, and I had been in the business for a long time. I was pretty experienced for 21, a 15-year veteran. We were eager to take the Destiny Band and concept on the road, but I got hoarse from too many shows, too much singing. When we had to cancel some performances, no one held it against me, but I felt as if I was holding my brothers back after the great job they had done while we worked together to get us all back on track. We made some makeshift adjustments in order to ease the strain on my throat. Marlon took over for me in some passages that required holding long notes. Shake Your Body Down to the Ground, our set piece on the album, turned out to be a lifesaver for us on stage because we already had a good jam in the studio to build on. It was frustrating to have finally realized our dream of having our own music as the showpiece rather than the novelty song and not being able to give it our very best shot. It wasn't long, however, before our time would come. In looking back, I realized I was more patient than perhaps my brothers wanted me to be. As we were remixing Destiny, it occurred to me that we had left out some things I hadn't talked to my brothers about because I wasn't sure they'd be as interested in them as I was. Epic had arranged in the contract that they would handle any solo album I might decide to do. Perhaps they were hedging their bets. If the Jacksons couldn't make their new sound work, they could turn me into something they can mold for the rest of my life. That seemed like a suspicious way of thinking, but I knew from experience that money people always wanted to know what is going on and what can happen and how to recoup their investment. It seemed logical for them to think that way. In the light of what's happened since, I wonder about those thoughts I had, but they were real at the time. Destiny was our biggest success as an album, and we knew we had really reached the point where people bought your record because they knew you were good and knew you'd give them your very best on every song and every album. I wanted my first solo album to be the best it could be. I didn't want Off the Wall to sound like outtakes from Destiny. That's why I wanted to hire an outside producer who wouldn't come to this project with any preconceived notions about how it should sound. I also needed someone with a good ear to help me choose material because I didn't have enough time to write 2 sides of songs I'd be proud of. I knew the public expected more than 2 good singles on an album, especially in the discos with their extended cuts, and I wanted the fans to feel satisfied. These are all the reasons why Quincy proved to be the best producer I could have asked for. Quincy Jones's friends called him Q for short because of a love he has for barbecue. Later, after we'd finished Off the Wall, he invited me to a concert of his orchestral music at the Hollywood Bowl, but I was so shy at the time that I stood in the wings to watch the show as I had as a child. He said he expected more from me than that, and we've been trying to live up to each other's standards ever since. That day I had called to ask his advice about a producer. He started talking about people in the business, who I could work with and who I'd have trouble with. He knew track records, who was booked, who'd be too lax, who'd put the pedal to the metal. He knew Los Angeles better than Mayor Bradley, and that's how he kept up with what was going on. As a jazz arranger, orchestrator, and film composer, someone people thought was on the outside looking in as far as pop music was concerned, he was an invaluable guide. I was so glad that my outside source was a good friend who also happened to be the perfect choice for a producer. He had a world of talent to choose from among his contacts, and he was a good listener, as well as a brilliant man. The Off the Wall album was originally going to be called Girlfriend. Paul and Linda McCartney wrote a song of that title with me in mind before they ever met me. Paul McCartney always tells people this story about me calling him and saying we should write some hit songs together, but that's not exactly how we first met. I saw Paul for the first time at a party on the Queen Mary, which is docked in Long Beach. His daughter Heather got my number from someone and gave me a call to invite me to this big party. She liked our music and we got to talking. Much later, when his Wings Over America tour was completed, Paul and his family were in Los Angeles. They invited me to a party at the Harold Lloyd Estate. Paul McCartney and I first met at that party. We shook hands amid a huge crowd of people, and he said, "You know, I've written a song for you." I was very surprised and thanked him, and he started singing Girlfriend to me at this party. So we exchanged phone numbers and promised to get together soon, but different projects and life just got in the way for both of us, and we didn't talk again for a couple of years. He ended up putting the song on his own album, London Town. The strangest thing happened when we were making Off the Wall. Quincy walked up to me one day and said, "Michael, I've got a song that's perfect for you." He played Girlfriend for me, not realizing, of course, that Paul had written it for me originally. When I told him, he was astonished and pleased. We recorded it soon after and put it on the album. It was an incredible coincidence. Quincy and I talked about Off the Wall and carefully planned the kind of sound we wanted. When he asked me what I most wanted to have happen in the studio, I told him, we've got to make it sound different from the Jacksons. Hard words to spit out, considering how hard we'd worked to become the Jacksons, but Quincy knew what I meant, and together we created an album that reflected our goal. Rock With You, the big hit single, was the sort of thing I was aiming for. It was perfect for me to sing and move to. Rod Temperton, whom Quincy had known because of his work with the group Heatwave on Boogie Nights, had written the song with a more relentless, get-down arrangement in mind, but Quincy softened the attack and slipped in a synthesizer that sounded like a conch shell's inside on a beach. Q and I were both very fond of Rod's work, and we eventually asked him to work on stylizing 3 of his songs for me, including the title cut. Rod was a kindred spirit in many ways. Like me, he felt more at home singing and writing about the nightlife than actually going out and living it. It always surprises me when people assume that something an artist has created is based on a true experience or reflects his or her own lifestyle. Often, nothing could be farther from the truth. I know I draw on my experiences at times, but I also hear and read things that trigger an idea for a song. An artist's imagination is his greatest tool. It can create a mood or feeling that people want to have, as well as transport you to a different place altogether. In the studio, Quincy allowed the arrangers and musicians quite a bit of freedom to express themselves, perhaps with the exception of the orchestral arrangements, which are his forte. I brought Greg Phillinganes, a member of the Destiny team, over to run the floor on numbers that he and I had worked together on in Encino, while the studio people were being lined up for the date. In addition to Greg, Paulino DaCosta was back on percussion, and Randy made a cameo appearance on Don't Stop Till You Get Enough. Quincy is amazing and doesn't just pick yes men to do his bidding. I have been around professionals all my life, and I can tell who is trying to keep up, who can create, and who is capable of crossing swords once in a while in a constructive way without losing sight of the shared goal. We had Louis Thunder Thumbs Johnson, who had worked with Quincy on the Brothers Johnson albums. We also had an all-star team of Wawa Watson, Marlo Henderson, David Williams, and Larry Carlton from the Crusaders playing guitar on the album. George Duke, Phil Upchurch, and Richard Heath were picked from the cream of the jazz funk crop, and yet they never let on that maybe this music was a little different from what they were used to. Quincy and I had a good working relationship, so we shared responsibilities and consulted with one another constantly. Okay, so we are going to pause there. I have to say, I hate the idea of pausing here, but it's the best break in chapter 4 to allow for some balance between this episode and the next episode, which will finish chapter 4. So bear with me. I'm sorry about a kind of awkward break in the middle of talking about Off the Wall and the various songs. Though so far we've only heard about a few, so most of the album we have left to talk about next week. So there's a lot to discuss here in this section. It was about 15 pages with a few photo pages scattered in there. And so let's just get into it. Let's have a review of everything we have learned from Michael here. So we start chapter 4 with some insight into Michael's developing relationship with Quincy Jones and how that came to be. I don't normally comment on the photography that much, but you guys... What can I say? Just the first page of chapter 4, the chapter starts on the right, and on the left is this incredible photo of Michael with Quincy Jones. And it looks like it's during the bad era. Quincy is laughing and he looks happy, and Michael is laughing and he looks absolutely incredible. What can I say? It feels wrong sometimes to not acknowledge these photos and be like, my God, have you seen him? It's crazy. I'm not trying to sound superficial, but I mean, I'm only a woman. What can I do? Anyway, Michael is breaking my heart, and that's all I'll say about that. Let's move on. I love this first introduction to Michael reflecting on his relationship with Quincy, specifically this whole piece about like he met him when he was 12 years old and Sammy Davis Jr. introduced them. Like, what a life Michael has led that at 12 years old, he is at a party with Sammy Davis Jr. You know what I mean? Like, I feel like he probably doesn't fully appreciate how strange that is to the average person who'd be reading this. You know, it's just such an odd life filled with this all-star cast of people. And I hope it's true. I love the idea that immediately at 12 years old, Sammy Davis Jr. could tell when he looked at Michael what and who he was and what he would become. It's just the stuff of legends, you know, which I just adore. But I find this part really interesting because it shows a little bit of like discord to me. And by that, I don't mean any kind of heavy discord, but maybe a little bit of Michael's frustration in how people present things to the world. So he says that he genuinely did not have any plan or idea for Quincy to produce his album. He called him up, he was talking, they were chatting about music, and he innocently asked, "What kind of producer do you think I should work with?" And then it evolved from there. I have heard Quincy say in the public, in interviews, I've heard him say that he thinks Michael was kind of putting on a ruse and was actually trying to ask him. And Michael has here said that isn't true. And he says this, but that's not the truth. And even though this is a lighthearted thing, it's a very lighthearted thing, right? I think this is a good example of many, many cases where someone who worked with Michael or knew Michael shares their version of a story, and the public can start to assume that version is more true than Michael's. Now, I don't know, I wasn't there, but I don't see any reason Michael would lie about that. You know, I mean, I don't know why that would be the case. I do think it's possible that in an industry like the music industry, where Quincy was so ingrained and had spent so much time working with like the biggest people, and just like Michael says here, he knew everyone. You might find it hard to believe that someone was kind of as wide-eyed as Michael was, just innocently talking and having this conversation and asking for a recommendation. It might be hard to believe that he wasn't trying to get something from him, because perhaps that's what's normal in this culture. And that's what's normal in this industry, is someone is always trying to get something from someone. And again, I'm not trying to make this example sound like bigger than it was, but I do think Michael's intentionally correcting a narrative here, not because it's actually that big of a deal, but because this is just another example of ways in which, for him, he's being completely sincere and people are misinterpreting it or misrepresenting it in some way. So even though this isn't, a super heavy topic or anything like that, I do think for us as even fans, it kind of shows like, yeah, this is constantly something he dealt with, and it's something we still deal with. Where even today, in the year 2026, we see people who are collaborators with Michael come out and claim credit for things that they never claimed when Michael was alive. Or they tell a story that something happened a certain way, which they never said until Michael was no longer alive. And then the fans and the public, they start to take it literally, or they start to take it because, I don't know, Michael isn't here to respond, because Michael was not the kind of person who typically did respond when this happened, outside of this book. And I just think it's something we have to pay attention to. Now, of course, again, lighthearted here, right? This doesn't matter. They're friends here. They're talking about it. But I just think it's an interesting example of what I'm talking about. People don't tend to assume as much innocence from Michael's part. People tend to believe other people for some reason. I'm not really sure what the reason for that is, but I guess I just wanted to call some attention to that. What's interesting for me moving on from here is that simultaneous to Michael developing plans to work on Off the Wall, he was actively developing plans to work with the Jacksons, to develop the production company, to put out Destiny, to go on tour with Destiny. So think about this timeline. We have The Wiz come out in 1978. Destiny comes out in 1978. Off the Wall comes out in 1979. Triumph comes out in 1980. Thriller comes out in 1982. So in the space of literally 4 years, in terms of release, I mean, I guess if we extend it to the time frame that they were working on these things, 5 years, in the space of 5 years, Michael is working on and releasing 4 studio albums, going on 2 major tours with Destiny and Triumph, filming his first movie, and releasing Thriller, which would have become the biggest album of all time. You know what I mean? Like, that's crazy. When you actually think about it, the like back-to-back dates of what he was doing, it's insane. So he was in a really kind of almost like a creative renaissance at this moment, where every aspect of his creative world was exploding, and his own ability to tap into what his dreams were and what he wanted, what he was trying to create, all coincided at the same time, along with his desire to grow some independence. And it's kind of obvious when you see Destiny and Triumph kind of peppered between The Wiz, Off the Wall, and Thriller. You know, Michael was dipping in and out of his own world, his own creative identity, and then back into his family's connection and their musical synergy, you know? So this is a very, very intense time in his life. It's amazing to me to think that he worked with his brothers to create this Peacock production company. I also really love this whole section, not just because of, you know, learning about that drive that he had, but just the symbolism of the peacock and what that meant to him. He quotes this article. He says, "The writer said that the peacock's full plumage would explode only when it was in love, and then all of the colors would shine. All of the colors of the rainbow on one body." I just love it because this just reminds me a little bit of last season when we talked so much about Michael's fascination with animals and the environment and like looking at the metaphors that exist in nature. And that is so accurate. I mean, this idea that the peacock only really flourishes when it's in love and it becomes its kind of most beautiful self when it is in love, it really does kind of represent what you could say the impact of love is in our lives as people. No matter where you get your love from, no matter what love you feel, if you feel and have intense love in your life, whatever that looks like, profound, beautiful love should ideally bring out the most beautiful version of us, the best version of us. And I love that he was inspired by that. It always makes me happy to reread this and remember how driven Michael was when he was working with his brothers to create something that really represented what would ultimately be his own legacy, you know, talking about how traveling around the world and touring around the world exposed him to how music could be so unifying. He says all of this and very similar things to this throughout his career. I remember in the much quoted, at least by me, much quoted Ebony Jet interview in 1987. I'm laughing because if you listen regularly to me, you know I can't get this interview out of my head ever. He is asked if he would ever want to be an ambassador around the world, and he says, "I feel like I already am with my music." And it's pretty evident when you see this. Actually, and this is a little bit of a side note, but like this being part of Michael's whole mission, you know, to unify and spread love. I was just reading an article today on MJ Vibe. And it said that I guess there was some really big meeting of dignitaries and things that I don't know anything about the context of it. I just know there was this meeting in Munich between a bunch of world leaders. And I guess at some point they were filming them walking into this building and they caught a glimpse on camera of the Michael Jackson memorial that exists in Munich. And if you don't know about this memorial, you don't know what this is, it's a really incredible public memorial that has just been like permanently a fixture there, where people have photos of Michael and like gifts that they leave him and messages for him and flowers and stuff. It's like this big public spot. And it's just amazing to me that that can even exist and not be trampled or harmed. That would never get by in America. I'm just being honest with you. Someone is always out to kind of ruin things here. But the fact that that's been maintained in some degree for so many years, because I think it was put up after he died, I believe. And yeah, it's just kind of cool. Anyway, the article featured this and was talking about how the backdrop of having Michael Jackson's memorial right there, when everything he represented was this global unity. It was just like an interesting moment to see it again in the media, you know? I don't know. I just thought of that because I read it earlier today. So maybe I will link it in the description so you can check out the article if you're interested. Needless to say, he says they formed this production company because they were interested in doing more than just singing and dancing, but also being writers, composers, arrangers, producers, and publishers. And they had all these different projects they wanted under this umbrella. I don't know, and I have to research this because I don't know. At what point did that production company ever really dissolve? Did Michael ever leave it? What kind of projects outside of the albums did they put out? I'm very curious about this. And so maybe I'll look into this a little bit more and follow up in the future, because I think that is notable and kind of important. I mean, he's a teenager essentially forming this. And I want to know what he did with that and what they all did with that and what projects manifested from it. So maybe I'll look it up and report back my findings. So Michael talks a little bit about writing and producing the Destiny album. He doesn't really give as much detail as I would have expected, to be honest. Like I kind of forgot how little he talks about it, and I wonder why. And I keep wondering, does he talk about it again later? But it doesn't seem like he's going to. So I'm a little bit disturbed by this, Michael. What is going on? There are so many songs I want to hear him talk about, like Push Me Away, for example, which is one of my favorite songs of Michael's and the Jacksons. Bless His Soul, so many of these other ones. I know I mentioned this a couple of weeks ago, but I want to reiterate, if you are interested in the Destiny album and learning more about the history of it, the MJ Cast just had an amazing episode about, it was like a Destiny roundtable, and all the people speaking on it are people who are really very, very knowledgeable about not only the Jacksons and Michael Jackson, but about music in general. And it was a really fascinating deep dive. I really highly recommend it if you're interested, because Michael does not give us much to go off of, does he? I wish he would. However, I do want to mention a couple of things. So one of the coolest things here is that this is when Michael starts working with Greg Phillinganes. And for those of us who are deeply embedded in the Michael Jackson world, that of course is a name we know. But if you're kind of newer or not as familiar with all of the different people in his orbit, Greg Phillinganes worked with Michael for most of his career. I mean, he's on, I think, every world tour Michael did on his own. So he worked with him during the Jacksons era, but also moved on to work with him during his solo career. And so you see him in a lot of performances. You see him on stage with Michael, working with Michael, collaborating with Michael. He's a big part of the Michael musical cast, so to speak. So it's cool to see that began so early and immediately was such a synergy in terms of their connection. I'm not aware of Greg having any book out or anything like that, but I would be so interested to learn more, or to even have like a documentary about Greg would be really cool. I'm just very curious about, his relationship with Michael and how they worked so closely together. I do know he has some interviews, of course, I've listened to, but just neat to have that kind of grounded in this moment. I also want to chat quickly about, on the Destiny album, Michael's story and reasoning for writing That's What You Get for Being Polite. This entire part is really important, I think. Michael here is, I think, retroactively, because this is, of course, coming out in the late 80s, Michael, I think, is retroactively trying to explain himself to the world. I mean, I guess on some level, that's what we're always doing in memoir or in, sharing an autobiography or whatever. You're trying to explain your perspective and what you experienced. But he's describing a kind of hyper stress that he experienced, talking about identifying people who were trying to take advantage of him, about feeling unable to say no to his family and really struggling, if he ever loved someone, to say no to them. He says specifically, saying no to my family and anyone I love. And it made me wonder who else he loved that he felt maybe took advantage sometime. I mean, back at this time we're talking about the late 70s, early 80s time period. So who was in his life? Who were the people and the players? We don't know all of them. We know some, we don't know all of them. People who were taking advantage of his good nature, taking advantage of his desire to help and to give back. What he describes here is something I think a lot of people do go through in life, where at some point, at some age, some marker in our life, we have to reflect on what we want our lives to look like and how the people in our lives are either serving it and helping us get there and actively reflecting the life we want, or the people who are moving us further away from the life that we want. And it really, I don't know, I guess it breaks my heart a little bit because he was really young going through that. Like, I think a lot of people go through that at all different stages of life, of course. But, once they've lived a little bit longer, they've had more experiences, negative experiences with people. Michael's talking about this when he's like 19, and it's kind of sad to me, I guess, that he was that young and starting to realize that the world wasn't quite as, wasn't necessarily to be trusted in that way, or that people wouldn't always have his personal best interest in mind if they thought they could get something from him. He talks about this song called Patches by Clarence Carter, and it talks about how the oldest son is being tasked to take care of the whole family after the father passes away. And he says, like, sure, this wasn't my exact situation, and I certainly wasn't the oldest, but that is what happened. And yeah, his father didn't die, but I wonder if to some degree it's like, okay, we moved away from Motown. You were the one who pushed this, so it's up to you to make everything kind of work for us. And I don't mean that that's literally how it was portrayed, but it's obviously how he felt, right? I mean, there's clearly no lack of love here from Michael to his family. There's a desire to work with them. There's a desire to connect with them. He obviously loves them. I mean, he says right here, God and his family were at the very top of his list for everything. But to some degree, it feels like maybe it was a little bit of a trap for him, or it felt like a little bit of a trap for him. Again, I talked about this last week, but the Michael biopic is so far, in the trailer at least, hinting that this is going to be a big part of the story. And I know some people are a little frustrated that it seems to be focusing so far in this first film on the earlier stages of Michael's life and his adult career, rather than getting into the later stuff that a lot of fans, I think, perceive as being more important when it comes to clearing Michael's name or giving people a different perspective on Michael. But I actually think it would be sort of a disservice to Michael to skip past this, because as I was reflecting on a couple of weeks ago, in thinking really for the first time about how much Jermaine's departure from the group may have emotionally affected Michael and how hard that was, I feel like it's very easy to not consider how hard this time frame was for him. I mean, again, I read out just a few minutes ago here, I read out the timeline of all the things he was doing and producing in this very short period of time when he was literally becoming an adult. I mean, he turned from a teenager into an adult during that timeline that I relate of all the projects they did. He was very, very young, and doing that while dealing with this level of stress and fear. It's just an epic amount of stress for a young person to deal with. I mean, it's a lot of stress for anyone to deal with, let alone someone as young as Michael. But I like how he uses this as an opportunity to kind of move into why and how he ended up firing his father as his manager, which is super interesting to me. Now, my understanding is that he fired his father as his manager, so as Michael Jackson's manager, but that he was still working with him through the Jacksons. That's my understanding at this point, unless I'm misunderstanding something, and maybe it will be clarified later. My understanding is that this was just a decision about managing his own career. And he connects this in part to his father having a very different vision creatively for what he wanted. And Michael, this isn't actually during that section, but right before it, he says, "I've always been a dreamer," in reference to the song from one of their previous albums. "I set goals for myself. I look at things and try to imagine what is possible, and then hope to surpass those boundaries." Something I love about Michael, as if there's any limit, I love everything about Michael, but something I really love about Michael is how inspirational he is to me, as his way of thinking was not just within the limitations of what was possible. Most people, I think, when they set goals, they try to identify what is possible because they want to make sure they're not setting themselves up for failure, which is completely understandable and I think probably smart psychologically for a lot of people. But I kind of love that Michael always thought, how do I go beyond what is possible? So I think about this for myself. If I were to say, I want to publish this type of book or whatever, and that's what I think I can do, I would have to then dream well beyond that if I wanted to model my own thinking after how Michael did, And this is something that I've heard people talk about with him, like public figures like Kobe Bryant and people like that who have talked about him as an inspiration, but also people he worked with who were inspired by him because there was no sense of limitation with anything he did. In his mind, like a limitation was the boundary you had to break, which is really a cool way to approach creativity. It's a cool way, but kind of a scary way at the same time. Anyway, back to him firing his father, as he says. He says, did this change the relationship between me and my father? I don't know if it did in his heart, but it certainly didn't in mine. And he says, I was beginning to feel that I was working for him rather than that he was working for me. Now, it's a weird thing because it's his father, right? And I would imagine no matter how good your relationship is with your father, it would probably be a very difficult evolution to go from the fatherly role where you are the one making decisions for your children and you're directing them and getting them their deals and helping them, to then realizing you are now an employee of them and they have gone beyond you. Now, I think that in most really healthy parenting situations, that is the goal. And most parents want that for their children. They want them to go on and go beyond them. I want to believe that Joseph wanted that for Michael, that he wanted him to go beyond him. He didn't want to control him. But I don't think that's the reality. I think based on what Michael has said here, what he felt was real. And, you know, I can't help but think about something when I think about this part. I know I've talked about this before, and it is something I always feel some guilt about, as well as like fear of your judgment as listeners. But I know a lot of us in this fandom have at some point listened to at least part of the Glenda tapes. And the Glenda tapes, if you are not familiar, are tapes that were recorded without Michael's knowledge of Michael having private phone conversations with family friends that he had. There was this family he had befriended. He befriended this husband, this wife. They had some kids, I think, and they were people that he befriended, and he would call them when he was on tour and talk to them. And he would talk to both the husband and the wife, but he talked most often to the wife, Glenda, which is why they're called the Glenda tapes. And he's being recorded without his knowledge by that family. And I don't need to get into all the reasons, but you know, it's a betrayal and there's no way around that. And as fans, I do feel it's a little bit of a betrayal to listen to them, but I'm being honest with you and telling you that I have. And that's what this part made me think of. Because specifically there is a part where he is talking to Glenda and he's talking about the abuse he endured from his father as a child. And he says that he specifically remembers his father telling them that if they stop making music, that he will, quote, drop them like a hot potato. And he says that like he remembers that exact phrasing. So that's what this reminds me of when he says, I felt like I was working for him and not the other way around. I get the impression that love and security in the family was kind of held like a carrot, like a dangling carrot in front of him and his brothers. And maybe part of what Michael wanted independence from wasn't just the creative independence, but the independence from the fallacy that he needed to perform a certain way in order to be loved and accepted by his father. You know, maybe part of it is like, well, I want to know if you actually love me. You know, I mean, I'm sure it was very, very complicated for him. And as he went through his life, much older than he is when we're reading this book right now, and he's only, 29 at oldest, I believe he probably processed this more as he got older and understood more of what that did to him. I'm just guessing. I'm doing some armchair psychology and I'm just guessing. But, you know, that's got to be complicated. And so firing his dad, you know, it only gets a page here, but that's partially the nature of this book. Michael shares things. He gives a brief overview of things, but he does not get deep. And unfortunately, that's super common with celebrity memoirs, especially. It makes me wish Michael had collaborated with a literary writer and had written a more literary memoir where he would get real deep, but it's okay that he didn't. He's given us enough, and this is something that we can learn from either way. So Michael soon starts talking about the beginning creation of Off the Wall. And he spends a little bit of time here talking about his relationship with Paul McCartney. And of course, they work together again in Thriller, so I'm sure we'll hear more about it then as well. Although I don't quite remember, so we'll find out. But this is, again, another example, just like the one with Quincy earlier that I talked about, where Michael is sort of correcting a narrative. Now, granted, again, these are not high-stakes situations. It doesn't really matter if Michael initiated their connection to write songs together or not. It doesn't really matter what the genesis of their relationship was, but it is interesting to me that Michael had this meeting with Paul And Paul offered him the song Girlfriend and said he had written it with him in mind, which is so interesting to me because what year would that have been? You know, if this is, say, 78 when they're putting this album together, and that was a few years earlier, Michael would have maybe been like a much younger teenager. He would have been like 17, maybe. It's kind of cool to think that like Paul McCartney was aware of Michael and his voice and thinking about how to write a song for him. And the song Girlfriend is kind of funny because it is by far the most hated song on the Off the Wall album by the fans. As with pretty much every Michael song, I still love it. You know? Like I never understand hate for Michael songs, to be honest. And I'm not trying to be like sycophantic. I genuinely don't understand how anyone could hate a Michael Jackson song. Maybe I'm just an actual freak of nature when it comes to how I react to him. I have yet to hear a bad Michael Jackson song. I have songs I love more than others, but his voice and his energy and just like, I just feel just so much emanates from his music. I can't really imagine just being like, oh yeah, that song sucks. Next. Like, no, no, I don't feel that way at all. Girlfriend is an interesting song though, because the whole premise of it being that you're essentially having an affair with some girl that you're referring to as your girlfriend and you're threatening to tell her boyfriend about it. And yet it's told in this like very cutesy kind of sweet, almost like a bubblegum sugar sweet sound. And it's just so funny in that way. So I actually think it's a really fun song. I think it's really cute. I don't think it's the best song by any means, but it's a song I really think is adorable and I like it a lot. Michael has little laughs and giggles and little adorable mannerisms in it that just make it a really fun song to listen to. So revisit Girlfriend if you are one of those people who hate it, or if you want, tell me how wrong I am and tell me how terrible it is, because I have yet to have anyone really give a good argument for why they think it sucks. So anyway, I just think it's interesting that, again, he's saying, Paul McCartney always tells this story about how I tried to work with him first, but that's not really what happened. And I just kind of wonder about that. And in both cases, these are people trying to make it seem like Michael was like desperate to work with them instead. Again, I know it's not that big of a deal, and it maybe isn't that serious. It just reminds me, though, of how frequent this is a theme in Michael's life. Do you know what I mean? That's all I'm trying to get across. I'm going to move on. I'm going to leave it alone. But that's something I can't help but think about. And then the only other songs we really talk about from Off the Wall in this section are Rock With You and some of the other Rod Temperton songs. So, I mean, there's not much else that I have to add at this point about the rest of this section. I am personally really excited to read the rest of chapter 4, to get more into Off the Wall, and then of course get more into Thriller too. I'm really looking forward to it. Off the Wall is one of these albums that, depending on which fans you're talking to, they'll either say that Michael's album trinity is Off the Wall, Thriller, or Bad, or they'll say Thriller, Bad, and Dangerous. I think that's really neglectful of the albums that came after, of course, which, like, I always think of History as Michael's kind of magnum opus in a way. It's just so profound and so deep, but it doesn't get included as often as I think it should in those best conversations. But this is part of why I think it's irrelevant to actually try to rank Michael's artistry. Probably, to be fair, it's irrelevant to rank anyone's artistry, but I mean, for me, everyone is beneath Michael, and that's just the way it is. But yeah, Off the Wall is one of those albums that is either so appreciated by certain fans that they diminish other albums that come after it, or it is not appreciated hardly at all. There's also a problem where people will often give Quincy so much credit for Off the Wall, Thriller, and Bad. And as we go through and continue reading about Quincy's relationship to Michael and the way things evolved through each of these albums, I think we should talk about that and try to identify, like, how true does that feel based on how Michael is presenting it? I mean, I don't think it's true at all, but I want to hear, as we're analyzing and talking about Michael's words, something we have to keep in mind also is that Michael has pointed out some little corrections here and there with some of these people he worked with. But Michael in general was not a person that did that. Michael has actually talked about this before, and how in his spirit, in his heart, he actually didn't like to correct people. There's actually some evidence of Michael struggling a lot when it came to holding people accountable because he didn't want to hurt or embarrass them. And he talked at one point about how he would hear stories that someone would tell him about, like, oh, this person said that they knew you, or this person said they had hung out with you and done this or whatever. And Michael didn't correct the person telling him because he didn't want to embarrass the person who was lying. I mean, that's the kind of person Michael was. So when we interpret Michael's storytelling, not only do we have to look past somehow his desire for privacy and keep that in mind when we're assessing what he's telling us, we also have to think about who he was as a person, who was someone who really didn't want to hurt anybody. He really didn't want to embarrass anybody. He didn't really want drama. He didn't want any kind of unsettled stuff in the news. He didn't want to make anybody look foolish. I'm not saying the man was perfect. I'm just saying he was a very kind person. And so when he talks about who did what on albums, and he talks about how he actually met a person, or he talks about whatever, he is also doing that in the kindest way he likely can, because that is who Michael was. So again, this is another barrier to, if there is, and I don't know if I believe there is, but if there is a like capital T truth, you know, an objective truth about what happened, we may never really completely get that from Michael, only because he holds himself back from it in some cases, not because I believe he's dishonest. Does that make sense? Anyway, it's just something to think about as we close here and we continue to move along into Moonwalk. There's so many ways that we can psychologically analyze this man, and I've been doing it now for like a year and a half, and I can't seem to stop, and it's not going to end anytime soon. So with that said, for now at least, we will wrap and close, and I will look forward to meeting with you all again next week to finish out chapter 4 and continue moving through Michael's life story in Moonwalk. I hope you all have a wonderful, wonderful week and weekend, and we will talk again very, very soon. Take care.